And so there's this exact script. The person follows the script. I think it's all taped, so it's a precise thing, but you can't tell through the wall that it's taped. I refuse to answer. I'm no longer part. So the person is saying, I refuse to answer. I'm no longer part of the experiment. The experimenter is almost always saying merely 2 or 3 different things. I'll take the responsibility for this. The experiment demands that you continue. Well, the person is yelling, let me out of here, let me out of here, let me out of here, and then goes silent and remains silent for the last, whatever that, 3. No, 3:45 to 4:40. Oh, my God. There's a whole series of them. And then that was the film. And 65% of the people reached all the way to the XXX level. The backstory is that when Milgram first ran the experiment, he wrote a book about this in addition to running the experiments and writing them up. There first was no sound. You just hooked up the guy with the heart problem. Everybody went, there was almost no experiment then. Absolutely everybody goes to the XXX level when there's no sound. So this is another arbitrary feature of the experiment. He added a feature that makes one think nobody would do this. And independently, Milgram described the procedures to a bunch of psychologists and had them to predict. And essentially, everybody predicted that 0 to 10% of the people would follow this instruction, not 65%, because it sure seems like I didn't take your time with it. But if I described an experiment in which somebody in the other room is yelling, "Let me out of here, I refuse to answer, I'm no longer part of this experiment," obviously everybody in the room would say, oh, I would stop the experiment at that point. But those are pretty normal people in the experiment. The lesson is that, well, a bunch of people like us would not actually have stopped because those people were like us too. They were members of the community. They're actually screened in. If you report some kind of psychopathology, you're not in the experiment. I believe Milgram even made sure that these are normal, upstanding members of the community. And he gets that. And of course, the lesson of the Milgram experiment is the authority figure is just the guy wearing a lab coat in the experiment. Normally, in society, authority figures are real authority figures. They're, elected officials, military figures, the police. Milgram has set up something where the authority, the word authority and the obedience to authority almost should be in quotes. I mean, it's just some guy at Yale. In fact, he also reruns the study out of like a storefront in New Haven, Connecticut, just in case the prestige of Yale University was necessary, which it wasn't. You get very similar effects. Which makes you wonder why. So there's 2 questions. Obviously, I think in this case, the relevance to the world at large is pretty self-evident. It's might be quite easy for governments with much more authority to issue orders that people follow if some guy in a lab coat can do that. And also where here the act of aggression is to somebody you've met and is just sitting right in the next room. The standard story, which is probably pretty correct, is that there are a few reasons that all contribute to why this works. One is this feature of responsibility. The people in the experiment know that they're not going to be sued. It's quite clear that there's some sense of whatever responsibility means that can kind of be transferred from you to somebody else in exactly the way that Eichmann did it by saying I was just following instructions. 2 other subtle features are there are small increments of punishment. So at some point, if you're asking yourself, should I stop at 315 volts, it's terrible. You've just done 300 volts. How good could that have been if 315 is terrible? So stopping at 315 is kind of like admitting you just did something really, really bad, the 300, but now 315 is worse, so you'll stop. So you get sort of caught up in a system which you're almost having to admit having done something really bad in order to get out of the experiment. And finally, it's hard to get out of the experiment. If you say once to Milgram, I think the experiment should stop, Milgram says the experiment demands that you continue. So that you have to get out of the experiment, you have to refuse on 3 times in a row. There's a script for this. To say, no, I refuse to go on. Milgram says something. I refuse to go on. He says something else. Then if you say it the 3rd time, the experiment ends. This is the feature that makes it impossible legally to run the experiment again. In every experiment, in the United States, and they all run through an ethics board, if you say, I don't want to be in the experiment, for any reason whatsoever, I'm bored, the experiment stops immediately. So you can't, you can't really run legally the milligram, so don't do it, you people in TV land. You can't run the experiment again because you have to violate the ethics of experiments to run the experiment. You can run some kind of simulations, some other types of studies that are like the milligram study, but if somebody in an experiment today says, I want the experiment to stop, it stops instantly, medical or psychological. But again, the general point, obviously, none of the people expected, it's a safe bet that the people before the experiment, if you talk to them, would not have expected that they would walk into a room and administer shocks to somebody who already seems like he might have died. But that's what happens in 2/3 of the cases. So a hugely powerful social influence. The only thing that rivals the milligram experiment in sheer shock value is what comes up next. The intellectual point is that people often behave according to roles. That was true. The word roles is so obvious what it is that I hesitate to spell it out. You know, the simple point that if somebody's doing the talking and gesturing, it's not the case that that person's extroverted and everybody else is a quiet personality. Obviously, those people have certain roles, in this case, instructor in a class, student in a class. Almost all the time in the social world, you have some role. You're the customer in the restaurant. You're the student trying to get the tuition waiver. There's some identifiable role. That was true in the milligram experiment. You're a teacher learner. A particularly compelling case of roles is one that solved the problem, again, how would you get at the question experimentally in a way that's also socially relevant? Usually there's a society in which you have a role. You know, I'm a tax-paying citizen of the United States. I'm a student at a major university. You can't just manipulate it. People already have the roles. What a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo does is to create a mini world in which people are randomly assigned to roles. Because he and his colleagues are interested in particular in the roles associated with incarceration and the legal issues of incarceration, while also being interested in social psychology in general, they set up a mini experiment, or a mini prison, that is the experiment. The study is known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. In the Stanford Prison Experiment, it's done late in the summer session. People agree to be in an experiment the last 2 weeks. They're paid something, you know, hundreds of dollars. Lombardo gets a big grant, of course, to run the study. They know that there'll be an experiment in a simulated prison. We just want to see what life is like if people are imprisoned. And that they'll be randomly assigned to the role of prisoner or guard. This is the classic case in which we know when somebody does something, it can't be their personality trait because they could have been in the other condition of the experiment. You're assigned to the role of prisoner or guard. A few things happen. If you're assigned to the role of prisoner, you're picked up in a police car from your house, you get a prison gown and some numbers. If you're assigned to the role of guard, you get a police-type uniform and some mirrored sunglasses and a stick. That's pretty much the only thing that happens. There's some other small features, but basically, that's kind of it, as I wrote in the book. The prisoners and guards could have just played poker for 2 weeks. They didn't really have to do anything. Phil Zimbardo is there, but he's not literally telling them what to do. They could have spontaneously decided to play Frisbee out on the front sunny lawn of Stanford University, but that's not what happens. What happens is more like this. It's carefully recorded by Zimbardo, so these are real pictures.
Stanford University, Northern California, one of America's most prestigious academic institutions, and in 1971, the theme of one of the most notorious experiments in the history of psychology. I was interested in what happens if you put good people in an evil place. Does the situation outside of you, the institution,
come to control your behavior, or does the things inside of you, your attitude, your values, your morality, allow you to rise above a negative environment?
The negative environment Zimbardo chose to test his ideas was a prison. He would convert the basement of the university's psychology department into a subterranean jail.
We put prison doors on each of 3 office cells. In the cells, there was nothing but 3 beds, and there was actually very little room for anything else because they were very small. And here we had solitary confinement, which we call the hole. And in the hole was the place where prisoners would be put for punishment. It was a very, very small area. When you closed the door, it was totally dark.
Okay, so that, it's hard to quickly describe what happens, but it's easy to sort of see it.
Initially, I was stunned. I didn't expect rebellion because not much happened, and it wasn't clear what they were rebelling against. They were rebelling against.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm skipping the not run through the whole class. After about a half a day, the prisoners are being, in some cases, beaten by the guards. So much so that the people who signed up to be in the experiment are staging a rebellion and trying to break out.
Rebelling against being anonymous, against having to follow orders from these other students.
As punishment for the rebellion, prisoner 8612 was put in the hole, and the guards turned on the other prisoners.
The guards felt that they now had to up the ante of being tough. The prisoners made the mistake of beginning to use profanity against the guards in a very personalized way. So not against the guards, but, you know, you little punk, you big shit, and so. And the guards got furious.
Prisoners were repeatedly woken in the middle of the night. The guards made them do menial, physical tasks and clean out toilets with their bare hands.
We made it a point to not give them any sense of comfort or what to expect, that, you know, that anything could happen to them at any time.
That's a guy from the experiment when he was a Stanford student who happened to be assigned to the role of guard.
Including being rousted from their sleep at any hour and forced to stand up on a line and have me hurl insults at them and then make them do exercises.
In essence, the experiment goes out of control. It's hard to describe the results of the experiment, except to say that instead of lasting for 2 weeks, the experiment spins out of control. Philip Zimbardo, who's in the study and apparently maybe was awake for 48 hours continuously, reports, in any crowd setting, I know this guy a bit too, reports that he essentially lost his normal sense of being an experimenter. At one point, he runs into another faculty member who says, "Where's the control group of the experiment?" and gets mad at the guy. "Control group! They're trying to escape!" And it's after 2 days of this, his wife, who's a social psychologist also at the University of California at Berkeley, drops in and tells him the experiment has to stop because now, like, the prisoners are being hit by nightsticks with the guy. I mean, people are kind of losing it. The experiment goes totally out of control. Again, in this case, not being based on anything that could be people's in personal qualities, because the prisoners could have been guards and vice versa, but the setting, which I will briefly say reminds Philip Zimbardo of the setting of Abu Ghraib, where American soldiers, who certainly couldn't possibly have been, you know, imagining themselves committing acts against prisoners before entering the military, are in a similar kind of prison setting. He suggests even if you're a good person, the setting can flip your behavior and essentially create evil. The argument here is that the sources of evil may be entirely in the situation. I want to briefly point to something. Don't miss this in your textbook in case there's an exam one day. Your textbook is really kind of 2 books. Your textbook is, that's why there's a pedagogical author. Instead of there was an olden day in which people used to buy a study guide. Like, the first book isn't expensive enough. There'd be a second book. Your book essentially has a study guide built into it. Well, there's nothing to worry about yet. As I said earlier, there's no exam until February 10th. But there's a bunch of stuff in the book, preview questions, definitions, questions that will be like what we'll have on the exam, and reviews at the end in Appendix B that are all essentially your preview of what exams will be like. So you've got, buried in the back of your book, handy summaries, and you've also got throughout the book questions that are not in content unlike what we'll have on exam.